Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Rhonda Hull, and I am an end-of-life planning consultant. And I also am a co-founder of an organization called Dying Matters Guild in Port Townsend, Washington. I am delighted to introduce a call that's kind of furthering the conversation about V.S.E.D, voluntary suspension of eating and drinking. In this conversation today, I have called together co-founder of Dying Matters Guild, Carrie Andrews, who also is an end-of-life planning consultant and advocate, and Ned Schumann, who is a founder of Olympus.net and internet company here in Port Townsend, Washington, and also Jim Ruff, who is and continues to be very involved with wisedemocracy.org. The reason I call this group of wonderful people together is that it was Carrie's mom and Ned's wife who they both very vulnerably and courageously walked through the journey of voluntary suspension of eating and drinking, an option that together they chose to support her wishes, so that she would need not endure a long journey with Alzheimer's and dementia. And we also will have on our call Jim Ruff. I've shared two wonderful interviews with him in the past, and it was his wife, Jean, who also chose voluntary suspension of eating and drinking. Through those conversations with Jim and the work that I do with Carrie Andrews, it became clear to me that having another conversation, even though it will be a long interview, it was worth having this interview where now, a couple of years later, after the passing of both Jean and Kate, that the husbands could share their insights. We would have the perspective from a daughter who walked with her mom through that choice. V.S.E.D is not an easy choice, and yet when you consider the lengthy challenges that come with Alzheimer's dementia, it seems like a very important and humane one. And so I am adding this little interview because I know that it's important that you know who is involved in this very important conversation that hopefully will help us all expand the understanding and the accessibility to voluntary suspension of eating and drinking as an important choice for those who are facing illnesses that cannot be addressed with the whole medically assisted death. So I invite you to pull up a chair, grab your cup of tea, open your heart, and listen closely. And it is the hope of everyone who participated in this conversation that it will serve the greater good. Tell me a little bit about your definition of voluntary suspension of eating and drinking, and then maybe if you would start us off with sharing a little bit about how you came to make that decision or support your mom's decision for V.S.E.D.
Okay. First of all, V.S.E.D, I think is a second choice for me personally. Medical aid in dying would be a preferred departure, but Alzheimer's is one of several diseases that does not qualify for medical aid in dying. So V.S.E.D is an option for people who have dementia, Alzheimer or ALS, Parkinson's. There are several different diseases that don't qualify for medical aid in dying. So V.S.E.D is really the only legal, easily accessible choice for people in those conditions. Mom and Ned and I had all heard a talk by Phyllis Schachter years ago, whose husband was one of the first people to, they were the first ones to really put a name to V.S.E.D. And she wrote a book about their experience, and it sort of entered the common lexicon, and she went on the road and talked about it. And I think V.S.E.D has done a pretty good job. It's been marketed well, I guess. There hasn't been the pushback against it that you would think, given the pushback about the death with dignity law. And so I guess as far as our situation, I think early on, from a philosophical point of view, Mom said, yeah, that I would do that. So when she was actually diagnosed, I don't think from the beginning that she was ever enthusiastic about the idea. I think that's where it really was more of a family process. She did not want to end up in a facility. She was very clear about that.
And there was kind of a family history of others.
Her sister had Alzheimer's and had been institutionalized for the last 6 or 7 years of her life. A good friend of Mom and Ned's is at San Juan Villas now. And then we knew of Jim and Jean's situation also. So we had these different cases. There's the long-term facility, and then there's, someone that we knew in the community that chose V.S.E.D. So I think, well, I'll let Ned talk about that, but when Mom and Ned and Jim and Jean all talked not long before Jean started her process. In my experience with Mom, she didn't really want to talk about it. She preferred not to think about it. Unlike the other people that I've been assisting with this process, who were absolutely convinced this is what they wanted to do from the get-go, and are sticking with the plan and are having to talk their families into helping.
Right.
Mom was lukewarm, I would say. And while she was never wavered from not wanting to end up in a facility, I would not say she was a huge, huge proponent.
Yeah, she would have preferred to have another alternative, and there just weren't any.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. Ned, how was it for you to make that decision together? And how do you feel that the two of you came to an agreement that that was the right course of action?
I would fold Kate into that. So as Carrie said, she was not a gung-ho, she was not a gung-ho participant in making this decision. She was much more passive, as Carrie suggested. And what made V.S.E.D appealing was that it was a socially accepted way to die under your own control. That was a huge part of it. So not only had we marshaled her friends together, her book group, and her other friends were all aware of what was happening, and they were very supportive of her. And all of that support system carried her along for a lot of that journey. In other words, it wasn't just a family decision. It was broader than that. It was a social decision of her entire social group was involved in this. So that that made it a lot easier because they were all understood and she felt comfortable with it. So I think that played a huge part of how how all this transpired. It was fairly friction-free, I think, in large part because of that.
Now, she had been diagnosed, as was Jean, with Alzheimer's, and Jean had Lewy bodies. But so where in the process, Ned, was, if you would describe a little bit about how the diagnosis was given and then when in the journey that was made, because I know, they describe Alzheimer's as mild, moderate, severe, and where is that quality of life versus quantity of life? Where is that decided when Alzheimer's is part of the picture?
We were all aware of Kate's cognitive decline. It was at first subtle, and then it became much clearer. And so her diagnosis was really a formality. It was a marker.
Mm-hmm.
And that marker we used for, of course, in the end, enlisting hospice in her dying. But it was a real marker for us in transforming what was an obvious trajectory into something that was more concrete. In other words, at that point, we can start making decisions that were well grounded.
Mm-hmm.
So they didn't, her diagnosis didn't change our understanding of her illness. We were well aware of it, but what we didn't have was the concrete part of it. And walking with a neurologist through her brain scans and looking at her hippocampus and the shrinkage and so forth, made it really obvious.
Right.
It was the tests, the MoCA test and so forth. So those were all just big support points in our own decision making. So as I say, the diagnosis was important, but it wasn't. It wasn't. Oh, all of a sudden we woke up and realized that she was suffering from dementia.
Now, were you, from the onset of her diagnosis, or even with her primary care physician, how did you always feel like you had the support you needed and were well informed by the medical community on what your options were? Or is that something, Carrie, maybe you can speak to that a little bit, that because you're involved with being an advocate for people here in our community, you were a little more plugged into knowing the care providers, the doctors, but can you speak to that a little bit on how that is important for someone who is considering V.S.E.D to know where to go and how to get the support they need?
Yes. First of all, I would say just a little PSA that early diagnosis does make a difference. And in retrospect, I wish we had had mom diagnosed earlier, partly because I've seen, and mom did end up on Aricept, right, for a while.
Which is a
Yes, I think she did. In fact, I know she did because she ended up at the hospital for something else and they noticed it. But in any case, I've seen with a couple of clients now where Aricept has really slowed the progression quite considerably for, with somebody now that she's had 6 months where her cognitive function, I would say, has actually improved a little bit. And it's not a cure and it's not going to change the outcome. But what it does is it gives you more time to find a provider that will be supportive and to create some documentation that supports your case. We started working with mom on creating, we went through Alzheimer's paperwork, the End of Life Washington Alzheimer's paperwork. And I want to say we started doing that pretty soon after her diagnosis. I think that was maybe a trigger for, okay, we really have to get this done. And then worked with her on creating value statements that really clearly said, and what Jean had written was hugely helpful. In fact, I continue to use what Jean wrote in classes, other people, to help them see how clear and how helpful that is. Mom's primary care physician at the time, I don't think she'd even seen in fact, I know she hadn't seen him because she'd been assigned to him when hers left. So she'd been seeing the nurse practitioner, and I wouldn't say they were really an integral part of any of this diagnosis. Or Mom went to a neurologist on Bainbridge, and I don't even know how much communication there was back and forth. Ned, did the nurse practitioner, was she the one that did the MoCA test initially? And is that how you got the referral to the neurologist?
That is correct.
Okay.
So I would like to just jump back for a moment to your earlier question about support, Rhonda. And a critical part of our understanding where we were, and I mentioned this in the obituary that I wrote for Kate, was good part thanks to Jim. And not only did Kate and I, well, the four of us had a discussion, I would think a couple of months before Jean started her V.S.E.D. So that was very helpful to have that discussion. The critical part of the most difficult part of the decision making was not should she do V.S.E.D, but when should she do V.S.E.D. It's such a difficult time. It's so hard to know what that balance is, and that is where Jim was really helpful. We had this last part of Kate's life was in summertime, so we invited Jim over to sit with us, and the four of us sat out on the lawn, and Jim played a recording that he had made with Jean. And she was so articulate. This was shortly before her death, in comparison with Kate's degree of mental strength, that it was obvious to us that Kate's time had come, and we had left that decision late, and it was somewhat of a concern whether she was still able to make these decisions as to when it happened. It was that close to the boundary. So Jim's presence and his expression of where Kate was very helpful for all of us. And Carrie and I instantly knew the time had come.
And I would say even Mom knew after that. I remember the look on her face listening to Jean talk. And after Jim left, she said, I think it's time.
So without that help, and that's not the kind of help that you're going to get from a medical practitioner to tell you the time has come. That is a decision that you, the family, the patient needs to make. And so there's no guidance. And again, that's when you are really dependent upon outsiders, as in Jim's case, to help with that guidance. It's critically important.
Well, in my experience, and Jim, you've spoken to this in past interviews a bit, of how Jean would have, it's not a straight journey. It's where Jean would have clarity and then she wouldn't, and then she would have clarity and then she wouldn't. And that back and forth also created great anxiety for her. And so that many people, because they don't set these markers, that slope can go very quickly. And so when someone starts considering it because you kind of are wanting not to accept that that is the destiny ahead, when it becomes the point where you're willing to address it, it becomes the slope is moving too fast, and you can't, the awareness of how long a journey the decline with Alzheimer's can be, not only in length of time, but in expense and at the sacrificing quality of life. So can both of you, all of you, really speak to how you defined where the line was to define quality of life that both Jean and Kate felt clear about and accepting of? What were some of those steps so that people walking this journey can say, yeah, I need to acknowledge that I have addressed every way and documented every possible way, and then how do they get the support they need to step forward? So Jim, do you want to speak to that a little bit?
I'll try, but really very touching to hear Ned and Carrie talk about Kate's journey and decision. And that was incredibly difficult for us too, the when question, because Jean, you know, we all, and it was really helpful for me to hear you say that it was just a marking. The diagnosis was just a marking, and that was true for us too. We knew, but the diagnosis was an important step. But there you are. My son works for Holland America Cruise Line, so we had a cheap cruise ship, and Jean grew up. The nearest big city to her was Montreal. And so we flew to Montreal to be able to take this cruise, which is great for somebody with Alzheimer's, because you go out together and you explore a little bit, and then you come back and you got your clothes in the closet and you're away from normal and you can talk. And so it was those talking times for us. But Jean could not say the word Montreal. And she grew up, that was the city closest to her when she grew up, and she could not say it, and she knew she couldn't say it. And it didn't matter how many times we just remember where we are, she couldn't do it. And that was a big moment for us, because we got it, that all this stuff we're doing, reading these books on the end of Alzheimer's and the Bredesen protocol and all these efforts that we were making, they weren't really working. And that was a step one for us, is to realize they aren't working, and just to kind of, I gave up being a food Nazi, you know, which was taking away from our relationship and our time together. So that was step one, I guess. And then the other step was really helpful for me to hear you say that it needed to be somebody from outside the family, because that's what happened to us. We ended up going on 2 cruises, and the second cruise was a friend, our oldest friends, you know, the oldest and best friends. And it wasn't me that was talking to Jean, it was them, you know, and they met with Jean and talked to her and helped her choose June 15th. June 15th, that was going to be the time. She had it all worked out in her mind about, she really wanted a hospital bed, and she was planning. But, and then you mentioned the Lewy body. As we got close to June 15th, she had a big scare, because Jean took a nap. And when she woke up, she didn't know where she was. She didn't know who she was. She didn't. And then it all came, and we thought, oh my God, we've waited too long. But then it came back, and Jean got scared. She wanted to start sooner. But we decided to wait because we had the family scheduled. And so those were 3 key points for us in the journey. But it really helped me to hear you talk about the marker and the diagnosis.
Yeah.
It was really nice.
How far, can I just ask a question, Rhonda?
Sure,
How
Carrie.
far in advance did Jean select her date?
maybe, I think it was March and then it was June. So it was, I think we took the trip at the end of March and then it was June 15th. Yeah. It was either going to be the spring or the fall. That was our question. And then it was, could she make it to the fall? And then it was a little panic. Oh my God, maybe we can't make it to June. When she had that nap that she couldn't recover from.
Yeah.
One of the things we did with mom was and we did it for a good part of the summer, was on Sunday afternoons, mom and Ned and I would all get together in the backyard and we'd have tea and pastries and we'd all just share briefly what we had seen that week. I saw mom once or twice a week, maybe. Ned obviously saw her every day, but we all just shared what we had noticed that was different. And like, maybe I noticed mom and I went to Silverdale and she was totally fine, except she was trying to pay for things with her library card. Or,
Right.
we went to the nursery and she told a great story and then she started it again as soon as she finished it. And,
Right.
and Ned obviously saw a lot of things. But it was interesting to me that mom was seeing things too. And she was less able to articulate what those were. But one of the things I would do differently if I were doing it again is I would have picked a date. And it could have been arbitrary. It could have been, we just didn't know. But if we
Right.
had a date, I feel like we could have enjoyed that summer more, because there was this extreme pressure all the time to like, is it time? Is it time? Have we waited too long? And I think mom felt that pressure. I think every time she forgot something, she felt judged and she felt like we were watching her to say, oh, see, now it's time. And I
Right.
feel like if we'd put something on the calendar, we could have moved it up or moved it back or whatever, but we might not have had to be diagnosing the situation all summer.
Right. I think that's valuable for you to offer, if you were to do it, if you had to do it differently, what would the things that those are valuable pieces of information for people who are scared and exploring this. And how did you receive any pushback once the decision was made? Did you receive any pushback from the medical community that would then provide hospice and palliative care support, or were they then all on board? How did you go about setting in place the things that you needed?
Well, in mom's case, the doctor she had been assigned, PAs cannot refer to hospice, only a doctor can. And the doctor she had been assigned, she had never seen before. And we made an appointment to see him. And then I did a little bit of looking into his background, and he has a very Italian name and is the head of Christian hospice in the something. So I called and said, this is what we want to talk about. Is this something he will support? And the nurse called back a half hour later and said, absolutely not.
Right.
So then all of a sudden we realized we were really ready to start very soon and had no doctor to do the referral to hospice. So I was able to call in a personal favor to a doctor who was able to, he saw her right away. And she was pretty far gone at that point. I think both Ned and I were afraid she had failed the audition, because she kept telling him how much she loved her life. And, we're like, ugh. But he asked her flat out, do you understand what V.S.E.D does? And we came armed with her value statements and her Alzheimer's paperwork and her advance directives. And he read through all those things. And he said, do you understand what happens with V.S.E.D? And she said, yes, I die.
Uh-huh.
And I think for him, what made the difference was that she had clearly thought about it ahead of time. She had the support of her family. He said, I wish I had known you when you were yourself, which I thought was a really, that was sweet.
Yeah.
And he said, I know that you're not who you were, but I believe that this is what you want.
Right.
And so he was able to refer us to hospice, and we got set up with them the next week. And then I think we had 2 weeks because we were waiting for our caregiver to get back into town.
I mean, so it speaks to the importance of everyone becoming more adept at being assertive and their own advocate when they see their doctor, to explore, like if you know what you want, where the quality of life is for you. I think it was Jean and your mom, Carrie, who had that, like, I want to be able to go to walk the dogs. I want to be able to remember. Those were more of the markers of this is what defines quality of life. That the sooner people can get that team in place and know that they have the support, then they can relax into it, rather than at that moment of grief and making, fear of, are we making the right decision? All of that, to have to scramble around to get support within the medical community. So how would you suggest, Carrie, since you do advocacy work, how would you suggest people exploring V.S.E.D as an option? How do they approach their doctors?
I would flat out say, ask your doctor at your next regular checkup. Where do they stand on medical aid in dying and V.S.E.D? I personally have found out in the last 6 months that the doctor I've been seeing for 15 years does not support either. Now, I have no intention of using either right this moment, but why wait until the day that perhaps I do? So I am on the search for a new doctor, and I have, I don't think there's any reason to put that conversation off. It'll shock your doctor, I guarantee it, but that's kind of fun. You just go in and say, oh, blood pressure's good. Also wanted to ask you where you stand on medical aid in dying and V.S.E.D. Because to me, there isn't any reason in maintaining a relationship with a doctor that is not going to support your end of life choices.
Well, and I know another thing that complicates it for us here in Washington is that there are a growing number of hospitals that are being bought up or, joining with Catholic hospitals. And even though one may not be Catholic and two may be, and they come into this conglomerate, the one odd person out will not support V.S.E.D or medical aid in dying within the hospital because they adopt the protocols of the other hospitals. So again, I prefer to have it tattooed on my forehead. Do not take me to a Catholic facility if they, so no ill meant toward Catholics. It's where everyone should be able to support their belief system, regardless of the facility they're in, is my belief anyway. So when did you get hospice on board and palliative care? What did that look like so people can be aware of, once they get their doctor supportive, how did that start a ball rolling?
Well, I'm curious for you, Jim, were you able to get hospice on board prior to Jean's starting?
Yes, it was it was really an educational process. Although for the doctors, I guess, we went to a regular meeting, for once a week meeting of couples, and there were 3 hospice volunteers at that meeting regularly. They were supporting this, and they were on board. There was no question, but the system wasn't. That they couldn't figure out how you're supposed to do this because you need to be 6 months to death with dignity, and the person how can the doctors possibly sign off? And we had a long-standing relationship with with our doctor, which might be yours. I don't know if he's changed his mind or what, but so and Jean really crafted the letter for him and for the hospice doctor. And we had it worked out that we could do it after the second day or something like that. But then they changed their mind and told us, no, the hospice doctor needs more time. So it worked out finally that we had, they had a system where our doctor could sign after 24 hours, and then the hospice doctor signed afterwards. And he signed like 2 days, a day or so later. And but then they were on board, and that was the whole deal. You can do V.S.E.D, of course, without it, anytime. It's just that you really want hospice. They're fantastic. And in our local hospice, I think we had all the volunteers seemed to be 100% with us, but the system just, couldn't imagine how this was going to work. But it was Jean's really. Whenever she sat down, she was very forceful about this and really wanting it to happen, and just, wanting the people to understand that this is something she needs to do. And so they didn't have a hard time with her because she was so adamant about it.
So Ned, for you, when did hospice get involved, and how was that process?
I first we'll talk about hospice, then I'd like to revert back to an earlier part of our conversation. But so let me deal with hospice first.
Sure.
Hospice was really extraordinarily helpful. Not only from a medical point of view, but also from an emotional point of view. In particular, the hospice, I believe the official title is chaplain for Jefferson General. She's also effectively the grief counselor for hospice. I talked about things that have changed me. I think her effect was much greater on me than it was for Kate, who was pretty much out of it most of the time because of the narcotics. So, but there were some downsides to the way hospice worked for us, which I'm hoping they are aware of. First of all, hospice bends over backwards to work the way that it is comfortable for the family. Where that didn't work for us was they had suggested that we get a hospital bed, but we said, well, instead we want to just move her bed out by the bay windows so that she could overlook the garden and see what was out there, but use her bed to do that. And they said, okay, we'll do that. That became a problem because actually before we got to that stage where she should have been in a hospital bed, she fell out of bed, and I was sleeping in the room right beside her bed with the door open. I could actually see her, and I woke up with a terrible groan, a terrible moan from her. She had fallen out of bed, and she was lying in a pool of blood. And I thought, oh my God, she's broken her nose. Turns out it wasn't broken, which was really fortunate. But that was a case where I would have preferred that hospice said, no, we recommend that she be in a hospital bed starting now, not waiting, because she was really getting out of it at that point and losing control. And that kind of risk was to accommodate us was unfortunate. it's a totally understandable why they choose to do that. They want to make this whole process as comfortable for you and as natural, and to preserve as much of your own life as you can. I totally understand that.
Mhm.
The other place where I wish that we had done things a little differently was in our training. So Carrie and I both got training for the use of the drugs that Kate would use as she got deeper into her death and dying. The way it started out, we were giving her drugs that kept her comfortable. And that is an experiment in progress. You really don't know, particularly when you haven't done it before, you don't know how much medication to give. You don't know how frequently, you don't know what the signs of uncomfortableness are. There's so much you don't know. And then there were parts at the beginning, before she got onto a regular routine of drugs, that I'm sure she was miserably uncomfortable, and that she needn't have been that way had we understood that process better. So that was another area where I think hospice could have instructed us. And I don't know, I can't suggest how they would do that better, but I think that is a place to be, for people to be aware of, is that they are now caregiving, administering powerful drugs without much training.
Mhm.
So those three, really, the extraordinary emotional guidance of the hospice staff and their over-the-top care, quality of care for Kate herself and her body and her existence was remarkable. So those are really the three ingredients that I have to contribute to the part about hospice. Going back earlier in our conversation, I should mention that there's a wonderful word, medical term called anosognosia, and it refers to someone's knowledge of their own condition. And why it is such a powerful word is that I think it applies broadly, probably to a lot of people, that they are either unaware or do not want to be aware of their condition. And that word really encapsulates the whole, that not only that state, but everything that it implies. And what it implies is that they are not going to be as active a participant in their own death and dying as they could have been. Jean, for example, seems to me from Jim's description to have been totally aware of where she was, and was one of those people who didn't suffer from that. She was there with it, an observer of herself all the way through. And that leads me into the value statement, which we should talk about, because I think, as Carrie mentioned before, the value statement is a critical document, I think, because it first of all, it is not a legal document, but it covers all of the gaps in understanding that a caregiver might have, or if let's say an outside person involved in somebody's care might have. It fills those gaps in and colors everything that hasn't been explicitly said in advance directives. Explicitly, I think what the value statement should say, or should be about, is one statement that is, or a series of statements about, explains why I want to live. The second part is why I want to die. And the third part, and this could be part of when I want to die, are markers for being alert from when you're on the trajectory. In other words, earlier on, years ago, you said, well, when I can't do this, I'm getting ready to go. Because when you are at that stage, you may well not be so accepting, but if you see that this was important to you years ago, it might spark off a light that, yes, the time is getting near. So, and that value statement should be uploaded to, in our hospital's case, there's a database where you upload your medical documents and medical wishes and so forth. So the value statement belongs in that uploaded official document for your medical record.
Mhm.
Let's touch on another aspect of this whole thing that I think is critical. And this conversation is about V.S.E.D. Were you to ask me, how would I die? I would say, I do not want to do V.S.E.D. V.S.E.D is a long, tedious process, trying emotionally. It just goes on forever, it seems. And not only the dying goes on forever, but the preparation for it.
Mhm.
Are alternatives. The beauty of V.S.E.D, as we've mentioned before, is that it's socially acceptable. Suicide is not. But there are some ways to die that are well documented, and there are organizations that provide this documentation. One of them I'll mention is closing off your carotid artery. You're apparently unconscious in 30 seconds and dead within minutes. And I know of a person who elected to go that way. She made the decision well about a year before the date came. She said, I'm going to die on this date. And she wound up doing it. And I don't know the details of her death, but she studied all of the alternatives and was very confident that it was the way to go. So I offer that as something that the people should, if they're looking for, as you've used the word alternatives, for me, that would be the way I would go. Likely at this point, that would be the way I would die. I would not choose V.S.E.D.
Mhm. Because it is, Carrie, you know, if you can speak to what it was like to support your mom through such a process. I mean, because it takes anywhere from a few days to 15 days to sometimes even longer than that. So I appreciate, Ned, you talking about alternatives, because I think socially, culturally, we are so afraid of that conversation that in other cultures, other parts of the world, it's an easier conversation to be had, but it gets very entangled here, you know. So I think it's helpful to know that there are alternatives, and then to know that V.S.E.D is the socially accepted choice to be made. You know, so Carrie, if you would speak to that just a little bit, and then we'll see if we can wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, I have told other people I would prefer not to go through that again.
Mhm.
It was, I think the buildup to it was worse for me than the actual process. The fact that the last summer we had with mom, we spent the entire time wondering if it was time for her to start. That took a toll, I think, more than the actual process. Once we started the process, I think I'd been dreading that for a long time. And once it was underway, it was easier. I agree with Ned in that not so much on the education around the medication, because I had actually been through that with my father-in-law, and I was aware of the fact that hospice turns you loose with this lethal box of medication and says, here's what these things do, see what works for you. So I wouldn't say more comfortable, but I was more prepared for the fact that there wasn't a lot of guidance there. if I were doing it again, I would have started her on a regular course of medication earlier. Once we finally got that dialed in, it was a lot better. But the first 3 days were hard. I came over every day. And we basically tried to stay busy. We listened to records one day. My daughter and her friend came over and played guitar and sang one afternoon. Mom and I went out and pruned things in the yard, badly, I might add. There's a hydrangea that's probably not ever coming back, but it was just something to stay busy and keep her mind off of things. And she was still getting up every morning and getting dressed, and she would greet me at the door. And Ned turned the water off in the house. We have another little apartment on the same property, and so we were able to get water and things like that over in the other building, but we did not want to have any food in the house. Or Ned figured out a way to keep the cabinets closed with childproof, because she really was at a point where she couldn't remember why she was doing it. And one afternoon, that for 25 years, I would just stop by kind of on my way home from someplace, and we'd have a cup of tea. And one afternoon, I think it was the 3rd day, she said, "I think I'm going to have a cup of tea. Can I make one for you?" And I said, "Oh, Mom, we're not doing that." And fortunately, Ned walked in right then. And so we all had this conversation. He said, "You can," but then, we were all just kind of, had to remind her why she was doing it. And she just looked at us and she was exasperated. And she said, "So you're telling me I can't have anything to eat or drink until I'm dead?" and it was funny. We all laughed. Because the answer was yes. That is exactly what happened. But I would say that was the last. She was fading the 4th day. We talked on the phone to some people. I don't think she got dressed that day. She was definitely, and then that was the night she fell. And then the next morning we got the hospital bed, and then it went on and on and on for 5 more days. So, and I don't know of anyone. I think Jean was 9 or 10 days, Jim.
She was 9.5, I think, yeah. But
yeah, Kathleen Clare's husband, David, he was 10 days. Everybody that I know personally, it's been right around 10 days. I think you see the thing, it could be up to, 3 today. You're like, great, let's hope we're on that side of it. But
Yeah.
I gotta say, at the same time, the first 3 days are kind of normal, right? I mean,
yeah.
So we're really talking about the back end, and the last 3 days are bedridden, and she's not really, she's not really part of the world as much. So it's really just that middle part. And in Jean's case, it was a ceremony for her that she was enacting. She had planned it. She had planned when the bed would come, and that where it would be set up, and that she would get to look out the window. And she had built the windows to be low on the ground so she could look out, and not then but before. And so and I guess I feel a little bit the same. I feel the same way. I think I'd look at my options, and I'd probably do it differently. But in Jean's case, it was a ceremony. The grandkids came, and they were there, and she was a part of that, and they would wheel her around in the wheelchair, and I mean, it was there was a whole family thing. And then the family left, and we took care of the, we had helpers. We had a team. We had 5 people, Ned, Crosby, and Pat, and my just family. And so it wasn't, for Jean, it was what she wanted, and she did it right.
And I think, as I've heard both of these stories and experiences, the other component is it was not only the death experience of Kate and of Jean, but so many people who had not been exposed to a dying process came.
Yeah,
The
they did.
grandkids,
Yeah,
the neighbors, everybody who visited, that there is something about all of us trying to find our way, knowing that all of us will die one day.
yeah,
It's a part of life that we can't control. In this case, you're saying this may not be the optimum way of all the ways that I wish I could die quickly and peacefully. This
Yeah.
may not, but this is better than years and years and years and years of Alzheimer's.
yes. Oh, yes. And Jean did it. It's a great, I mean, it is a real option if you've got Alzheimer's. I mean, seems to me you don't really have a lot of the others. Although Ned mentioned one, maybe you could do that yourself even. I don't know, but it seemed complex. I looked at a number of possibilities for when Jean and I were first started, and it was like, oh God, it sounds all awful. But
Plus the concern of your liability. I mean,
Yeah.
that's always the concern for someone, is that
Yeah.
they don't want their partner to have 3 square meals a day in an orange jumpsuit sitting in a jail somewhere,
yes, but yeah. So, but anyway, it's an option that appeared, and it was like, oh my goodness. And then Jean took it up and made it really work for her. And like I said, I mean, like Ned and maybe like Carrie, I'm not sure I'd do that for myself unless I had Alzheimer's. And then I think it might be,
Yeah.
then it's like a community event, or family event anyway.
Yeah.
So,
And I will say along those lines that was a very sweet part of Mom's dying was the people that came each night, and especially after she lost consciousness, members of her garden group would come. And what you were saying, Rhonda, about people's comfort level with death, it was interesting because there were a couple of nurses in the group, and they both expressed the fact that this was the most intentional process they had ever seen. They were used to seeing death in emergency situations or in hospital situations. And so it was different for them even, but I was there during the days, and around 5 o'clock at night, some of the ladies would come over, and sometimes my daughter would stop over after work, and then Ned would come down from the office, and we'd all have a glass of wine. This was after Mom had lost consciousness, but we told stories and laughed about things. And I just was struck by one friend of Mom's who, one of the first days, she stopped and knocked on the door, and I went and answered the door, and she practically threw some flowers at me and was leaving. And I said, "You can come in if you'd like." And the thought of that was just horrifying to her. And by about the third day, darn if she wasn't sitting around the bed with a glass of wine too. So
Right.
I think it was that community aspect of it,
Yeah.
Jim, that you were talking about, and as an education piece I think it was an education for all of us. And
Yeah.
the night Mom died, I was walking home with my then 24-year-old daughter, who was also present when Mom died. And I said, how are you doing? And she said, this whole thing has made me less afraid of dying. She said, I've always been afraid of dying. And she said, that actually wasn't bad, which was high praise.
Yeah.
So what a gift to her to have seen that quality of death,
Yeah. I think all of us, we kind of grow into wishing, hoping, believing that life is supposed to be comfortable, and we strive our whole life for comfort, when in fact life includes some really challenging times, which includes that uncertainty about dying. And so I think those who expand their comfort zone with dying actually will live more intentionally and more fully. And so it certainly is not an easy decision. It is not an easy journey. The three of you and Jean and Kate are so courageous because they have contributed to minimizing our fear about death, reminding us to reach out to our medical community and make sure that we have the support we need for the type of death we want whenever it might arrive, knowing that, what is it, Carrie, 80% of us want to die at home and 80% of us die in the hospital, and most of us want to die in our sleep and only 2 to 3% of us do. So there's so many uncertainties and unknowns. I feel you all, I'm really grateful just for what you've contributed for those who are facing this journey to feel like they have any choice rather than just live this long extended journey with Alzheimer's. And until we can adapt our culture to find a better way of honoring all of us really in our end days, it's nice to know that V.S.E.D is one option. And I'm grateful for the courage of Kate and Jean and all of you. So
Rhonda, before we wrap up, I have a couple of things I think would be helpful for others to hear. One is just going back into a technical issue of, and this really involves probably the spouse of or partner of a person who's going to die, is for that person to start creating a log of events early on so that they understand, because it's so easy to forget. Right. How does this begin? What are the signs? And if you don't do that, you are missing out on understanding the whole trajectory, because the beginning is so wishy-washy and vague and uncertain. And in looking back at it, some of the events that were apparent to me that were unusual were so touching in emotional ways. They at the same time, they want to make you cry and they want to make you laugh. Some of them are so unusual, unexpected. But so I think that the logging of behavioral events is really important. So the other thing, the two other points I'd like to make, one of them is that this discussion has largely been around the medical community help, and of course our own experiences. But I would also like to add another dimension to your understanding of this, and anybody who's listening to this, is the legal aspect of expanding V.S.E.D and the death with dying to open it up so that sealing off your carotid artery or other ways of dying are not socially unacceptable.
Right.
And I think the probability of a prosecutor in our county of sending anyone to jail is about zero, but that still doesn't mean that it isn't illegal and frowned upon to commit suicide. So the legal part of this needs courage from our legislators. And of course, that what involves the medical community and the legal community hashing this out with, of course, the electorate participating. But that's a huge part of this. And I'd like to just, the last thing I want to echo is what both Jean and Carrie have said about the time around Kate's bed as she was dying. She was out of it. Maybe she was on morphine and totally out of it for most of the last days of her life. But those were probably some of the most memorable parts of my life.
Right.
So the social, the relationships, it changes relationships. You understand about how people behave in such circumstances. You understand more about your friends. It's an extraordinarily eye-opening experience.
Yeah.
That's all I have to say.
I think that's a valuable contribution, Ned, because it's not only the death of a person, but there is a system. There's an extended system, and each person is touched and moved and grown and challenged individually, as well as a part of this system, this family system. So I believe, and I'd be very interested, Ned, to have you back and speak more about alternatives and how do we destigmatize that label of suicide. Because I think if we removed the label,
Yeah.
there would be less pain attached to that and fewer people actually who would make that choice, at least in a violent way.
Yeah,
So
I've never chosen the word suicide. I always say Gene died of Alzheimer's or Lewy body,
yeah,
and
or yeah,
I
or
don't know, it just doesn't, the word doesn't work with what she did. It was so beautiful what she did, and suicide is not a word that brings that quality to
yeah.
what's going on.
And it's an extraordinary experience, sacred to me, without an attachment to any religion. There's just a sacred spiritual energy around someone's passing. It's a moment in time unlike any other, and
It's really nice.
hopefully for many of us, we all hope that it's a nonviolent passing. And even in those circumstances that I've been there, when it's a very challenged passing, there is something very unique about that energy around that time that changes people. And the passing of someone, the death of someone, we've attached all of these sterile words to it somewhere around the late 30s, 40s. And from that point, death became a very medicalized process. It didn't mean that before that there weren't some really tragic, difficult passings, but it's where it became so medicalized that people lost their comfort zone, their identity in relationship to death. So you have all had the courage thrust upon you by your circumstances and just by the nature of who you are to make these death experiences of two people that the three of you couldn't have loved anyone more, that you walked through that journey in a really respectful, intentional way. And it mattered. It mattered to everyone who knew each and every one of you and who knew Gene and Kate. It mattered in a bigger way than just that, whatever that death might have been to them as individuals. It mattered to a system. So I'm grateful. Are there any other closing words for you today?
Yes, I would just like to add that I very much appreciated this conversation. It's a pleasure to go back and touch some of those emotions again.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you. And to have new insights as well about it.
Yeah.
I'll just say one thing quickly. We used to hang around people who were always talking about conscious death, and it never dawned on me until you just talked that that's what Jean did. She did a conscious death. It wasn't a conscious of the slipping from life to death, but it was conscious in every other way. So
It's intention. Yeah.
yeah. So anyway, and Kate as well, yeah.
Yeah. Well,
And
thank you.
I would just like to add along those lines that I think Jean was very, very conscious, and I think my mom was very reluctant. I think they were on opposite ends of the V.S.E.D spectrum, and I still think it was one of the bravest things my mom ever did. And I honestly, sometimes I'm surprised that she had it in her to do it. And I am grateful.
Yeah, that's a really, that really made that touched me, Carrie, because it's like, why, why deprive someone of such a courageous act? You know, it was brave. It was brave. And all of you were brave. And I feel that your bravery you know, each of us struggled to be the best little grain of sand on the beach of evolution, but it mattered. It mattered. And I think I'm hoping, I believe that this conversation, sharing this conversation, will matter and make a difference and cause a ripple that hopefully in the bigger picture, long after I'm gone, will evolve into making the choice of death an even easier process for those who are facing Alzheimer's. So, or any other tragic ending of a disease. So thank you very much, each and every one of you.
Thanks, Ned. Good to see you, Ned.
Yeah, thank you. And hopefully it was valuable for the two of you to be able to reflect back together.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you.
Great. All right. Thank you.